In this lecture, I will walk you through the SAM template.aml file that will create the infrastructure for our use case. We'll have two Lambda functions which will be triggered by S3 and SNS respectively. The first Lambda function will be triggered by a S3 event when a file is uploaded to S3. The second one is triggered by a message on the SNS topic. Here is the template.aml file. Under the resources section, we'll have two Lambda functions, but even before that, we'll have two resources. The first one is the S3 bucket. This is how we define it. Type is S3 bucket, and the only property that is required is the bucket name. I'll talk about this substitute function, which gives us an intrinsic way to create a dynamic name for our bucket using the stack name, the account ID, etc., which is very straightforward. The second resource is the patient checkout topic. This is the SNS topic. And you simply define AWS : SNS : topic. Once you specify the type, it will create the topic for you. So we have these two pieces in place which trigger the Lambda functions. Then we define the Lambdas themselves. The first Lambda is the patient checkout Lambda that will be triggered when we upload the file to S3. It has the common properties which you are aware of. Then the events section or block is where we define the S3 event. Type is S3. The properties is the bucket reference. So we point to the bucket that we create earlier on. And the events, the S3 event that should trigger the Lambda can be specified right here. For which event in S3 should this Lambda be triggered? Here we are saying S3 : when the object is created, when the file is uploaded, an object is created, : star. Meaning here you can define put, post, etc. because there are different ways in which we can create an object in S3. We are saying it doesn't matter how that object is created. As long as the object is created, trigger the above Lambda function. Next, the second bill management Lambda function, we use the topic as a trigger. So under the event section, SNS event is the name of the event. Type is SNS. So for S3 trigger, we use type as S3. For API gateway, we used API in the earlier use case. For SNS, it is type SNS. The only property that is required is a reference to the topic, SNS topic that we have created under the resources block. So that covers these two triggers and the Lambda functions we have. Under the Lambda functions, we'll define a few more things. The policies, of course, the security policies. First, the S3 read policy, because in the first Lambda, we need to read the file that we upload from within the Lambda function. So we are giving that security policy to this specific bucket, not all the buckets, just this bucket which we create above in the resources block. You will learn all that in detail again. Next, we also give this Lambda the permissions to publish a message to the topic that we have created up top, SNS publish message policy. And in the second Lambda function, the policies are very straightforward. We don't have any because it simply gets triggered. It processes the message that comes from SNS. It doesn't have to do anything on its own except for processing the message. And we use an environment variable in the first Lambda, which will pass the topic name because the topic gets created dynamically and our Lambda function needs access to this topic. So we use the intrinsic function called notRef. We get the topic name that is generated on the fly when we deploy, pass this as an environment variable to our Lambda function so that it can publish messages to that topic. So you're going to create all this from scratch and understand more in the next few lectures.